starting with Professor Nancy Pachana. Nancy is a clinical neuropsychologist and professor in the School of Psychology at Uni of Queensland. And Nancy's original talk was an abstract, but we decided that we thought it would fit nicely in this consent session. So I'm going to, with some rapidity, hand over to Nancy to start this session to talk about ethics and older adults and moving with the times. So thank you, Nancy, and over to you. And yes, we can see your preso. Just can't hear you.
Okay, yes, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you very much for having me speak today about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, older adults. So I'm going to talk about some of our research on older adults, some of our experiences as a research network working with older adults, and hopefully inject some of the voice of older adults themselves. I'm going to do a quick acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people as the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which I'm meeting today, although I realize everyone is spread all over the country. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And this is important for me to recognize the valuable contributions of not only within Australia, but all First Nations people to global society and their extremely positive models of later life engagement, including involving elders in all aspects of their culture and community. So this decade, maybe most people know, is the UN Decade of Healthy Aging. And this was not supposed to be a decade where we're focused on COVID. It's supposed to be a decade that we're focused on making the lives of older adults everywhere better. And this is a total societal engagement to improve the lives of older people. And one way that older people's lives can be improved is through research. I'm also speaking to you from the University of Queensland, which is the first age-friendly university in the Southern Hemisphere, part of the World Health Organization's age-friendly ecosystem, which includes age-friendly hospitals, age-friendly cities, and age-friendly universities. And so, you know, a lot of my time is spent thinking about age-friendly or age-inclusive attitudes. But, you know, sometimes aspirations meet inevitably age-associated stereotypes. The World Health Organization has estimated that basically 1 in 2 people globally hold moderately to severely ageist attitudes. And this is something that's not like, you know, exclusive of people in the room. It's all throughout society, and it can creep into also our research. So implicit bias and falling back on stereotypes is something everyone does, and we have to really be conscious of not falling into those stereotypes. But research has shown that being aware of bias can help mitigate harm. So, you know, it is something to keep front of mind. So I've been a researcher in later life for all of my career. And I have had many examples of, you know, questions that have come up from ethics committees, and I've done some research on this. And, you know, some of the things that come up can seem to be well-intentioned, but really are not helpful in terms of including older adults in research. So many is the time, I'm a neuropsychologist as well as a clinical psychologist, you know, I'm looking at people over 65 for some community study. Why aren't I testing everybody to make sure there aren't people, you know, with dementia in my sample? Well, there's only 6% of people over age 65 have dementia, and about 1 in 4 people have a mental illness. So I'm not really sure why the focus is always on, you know, cognitive testing. Or assuming lack of capacity. I've had even like care partners, you know, am I sure that those people have capacity? And these are the sorts of things that, you know, you can't help but think that this is sort of an ageist perspective on someone who's just over the age of 65. And that is the definition of ageism, just making assumptions based on chronological age. Putting arbitrary limits of age on research studies. So yeah, I run a participant data pool, and sometimes researchers will say, well, we're only testing people up to 85, but I have people up to 100 on my participatory pool. And so they might rightly ask, I'm 86, why can't I be in this study? And, there's a small number of studies that may have a very specific question that does warrant age parameters, but a lot of times it's just, I just set an arbitrary limit. And then the most frequent thing that I've gotten, although it's gone down possibly slightly after COVID, is, older people can't use the internet. So why do I have somebody filling out a form on the internet? And, ABS statistics say 75% of people over 65 to 75 use the internet regularly in Australia. So these are the kind of biases that if you're a researcher, you come up against. And we came up against this when we did a formal study of this. We, a group of us here sampled researchers in the United States and in Australia with their experiences of submitting ethics proposals on older populations. And we did a content analysis of their responses, and people had a wide range of responses. And I would say that for myself as a researcher, wide range of responses to ethics committees, sometimes incredibly insightful things. Sometimes it's just, a misspelling on page 6, so it's sort of a neutral experience, but sometimes it was quite a negative experience. And the positive interactions with ethics committees that really were kind of in tune with later life research, really, in partnership with researchers, having everybody be at the top of their game. But there were a lot of issues that were encountered, really, in terms of people's experiences with ethics committees. A lot of it involved informed consent and information requirements. And some of this involved can these people really give consent? And then asking this, but at the same time, requiring very lengthy or wordy consent or participant information documents, which seems sort of at odds with one another. Assuming vulnerability, even if you just have a role like a caregiver, this must be a vulnerable person. And so then I make a lot of assumptions about that person's ability to participate in research. Cognitive impairments, again, an assumption that is somehow tied with chronological age. And certainly the impact of some of these things on the extant research on older adults means that if you look up anything, treatments or investigative procedures or assessment tools, you find less and less data on older populations. And so we really don't know actually what is, for example, the efficacy of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, in people over age 80. But this is a growing population. A lot of concerns with participant burden. But really, again, it's just an assumption that, somebody can't talk to me for a half an hour or an hour, and when you do neuropsych, you sometimes have to do a lot more. And I could go on in some of these things, but a little bit of a mismatch between, what might be an assumption of how an older person approaches the chance to be in a research study, the chance to share their perspective, to share insights if they have an illness, to be able to contribute to the future. They know that probably this isn't going to help them, but it's going to help future people. I mean, this is the whole point of this kind of research. And later in life, it becomes actually even more important for older adults to feel like they can make these kind of contributions. And one of the main results of ageism is to rob people of this ability to participate in society, to kind of be in with what is happening and feel like they can be efficacious. Other concerns raised in the paper were that committees were overly focused on legal risk. And I know that the environment has gotten a lot more complex, but, again, possibly leaning towards then making it more exclusionary for older participants and not really hearing the voice of older research participants. When I submit a research proposal that deals with dementia, then I know that people living with dementia are probably going to read my protocol. And so, if you're writing and working in that space, you're aware of language and how you present things. And And I feel like that sometimes when I talk to people who are not in the gerontological area, they find that a little bit amazing. And I found throughout my career as a researcher, and we found in this study, that people were saying that some people did, especially younger researchers, just abandon working with older people because they thought maybe they were just so discouraged from some of their interactions with ethics committees. People had a lot of suggestions in the paper that they wrote in, and they said that, everyone who's involved in research, even certainly the researcher when they're setting it up, but everyone who's involved needs to reflect on, am I just couching things in this way, or am I making assumptions just based on biases and stereotypes? And involving consumers, whenever consumers are involved, you're sure that the voice of those people are represented. So having lay people on a research committee, for example, I might suggest maybe tapping also, Dementia Australia for people living with dementia to be on ethics committees. And then seeking further clarification from researchers if there is a question about some particular more technical or content specific issue that could really improve dialogues, because I think that, for myself as a scientist, the ability to have a dialogue, the importance of that is really continues to grow. I'm wearing my little dementia friend button because I myself am really passionate about having the voice of people living with dementia be represented in all aspects of research. And this is not my paper, but this is a paper from some colleagues about here in Australia about how to make that possible. And basically, some of the main points that they raise with this specific population is that research to improve the quality of care for people living with dementia has to include the full range of people living with dementia. And that includes mild, moderate, and severe. And of course, in any particular study, there are obviously, we can get down to that level, but in a general level, I think that's what we should really be aiming for. And to get a breadth of people, because if you've met one person living with dementia, then you've just met one person living with dementia. So you have to be broad and inclusive. And again, in this paper, as in the prior paper, some people did exit the field of dementia research because they just felt that the questions that they were asked, or just the difficulty of getting ethics approval, just made it aversive. And this is a shame because aging research in general is underrepresented, and that's also the case for dementia research. Then this session is about consent, but I'm speaking a little bit more broadly. The ability to provide consent and just provide a perspective or provide assent, that's a more technical term, these can be all valid things that can be bundled up into research, and providing the opportunity for a person with dementia to participate and offer support to do this and say, well, how can we facilitate this person really allowing their lived experience to come through is super important. Really, I can't emphasize that enough. So I've done research with consent, where consent has been an issue for a variety of reasons in populations. And this is a growing, burgeoning area of research about how to do this in a best practice way. And so, there are really kind of cool things you can do with consent and participant information forms, like using images or pictorial depictions, which actually sometimes are just easier for everyone to read. And these can be used to offer, for example, illustrate differences in treatment options. You can use electronic platforms that can give more data that people can go to and maybe get a fuller understanding of your study. And then building in infographic materials, and our wonderful ethics committee here at UQ is trying to do this with infographic materials so that people have an understanding of what this population is, because I think older adults are somewhat of a still kind of misunderstood population. So these are the kind of infographics I'm talking about, saying things like, how many older people are involved in social activity. This is Australian data. You often have a stereotype, and I know my students have the stereotype that older people live alone. Well, actually, 94% of older people live in the community. Older people are very socially engaged. I already said they were on the internet. how many people are over age 65? It's a growing population. Here in Australia, we do have a centenarian study. Like, these are the sorts of issues that I think, you have to have a complete picture of what's going on. And even people who are living with disability, who are living with dementia, we try not to use this language like suffering with dementia, because people living with dementia can be leading meaningful lives. They can be engaged fully, they can be content. They're not, this is a very kind of two-dimensional way of thinking about people living with dementia. And then social media, people are involved in social media, they're on Twitter, they're on apps. But what are some of the barriers for people, say, for example, accessing technology? Well, certainly the tyranny of distance, living in a rural area, not having a stable internet connection. Possibly this is due to socioeconomic factors, low income, things like that. So, it's not just age, it's sort of thinking about the whole context. And so this is the participant registry that I run. And so it offers a service here at UQ for people who want to advertise research. And we had noticed, and we had gotten a lot of complaints from the participants in our registry who go up to age over 100, that there were these upper age limits. So we were requesting, researchers to remove that. And that didn't seem to be an issue. People were really cool with that, and supervisors were cool with that, right? But also giving feedback back to participants. This has been the most vexing issue I find in our registry. And, I really think that when you put in an ethics application, of course, you talk about how are you going to get information back to participants. But and for some reason, it really doesn't seem to be a priority. And I will say that older adults, if you're trying to recruit older adults want to give their time to things that are meaningful. And if they're not getting feedback, or they're anticipating that they're going to be informed about what the research, showed, and they don't get it, then there's a chance that they, drop off registries or things like this, or they just become disenchanted. And so I can't stress enough that feedback to participants, I think it should be a regular part of the review and finalization of ethics protocols once the study is done. That did you really tell people the results of your study? There's a really burgeoning literature about consumers in research, and this includes older adults. It including older adults in the development of research, assessment measures, what is reasonable, what are even the questions that you're entertaining. And I think this is a really great and cool area of research that's really getting more older people involved in research. So I wasn't even really sure if we're taking questions, but I did want to say thank you to all of the people that have contributed to this presentation. I want to thank Health Translation Queensland for allowing me to speak, to all the research partners that our Aging Mind Initiative team here at UQ has worked with, all of the older adults who have contributed to studies over 20 years. It's been really a pleasure. And the consultations with the UQ Human Ethics Committee, which have been really productive. I have some references. My slides can be readily available. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Look, thank you so much, Nancy. And yes, there's time for questions. And look, I cannot disagree with a word you say, and I think we possibly all experience this. And no ethics committee, I think, wants to be obstructive, but unless you have the right views, it's sort of hard to come to those decisions based largely on what Wendy Litworth was talking about in terms of our own sort of, let's not call them biases, let's just call them views. I
did have an ethics committee tell a student, but not at this university, that she couldn't ask people over 65 their age. Because people over 65 can't remember how old they are.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no comment on that one. But I do think sometimes we're a bit, we're can be a bit conservative. And look, I just go back to something in my own Royal Brisbane committee, where I think our committee was a bit hesitant to approve a study until one of the members who had just experienced this event said, this was the most cathartic the most cathartic thing that happened to me when my relative was bereaved, where I was actually allowed to ask him, you'd be asked about support. So that was a turning point for me, and understanding that, you know, my view is but a view, and I need the view of lived experience people. Now, I'm just going to ask a few questions, Nancy. And Jo Farmer made a comment saying she'd love to connect with you because she finds exactly the same with younger people. Younger people can be excluded. And by the way, I hate being excluded from research just because I'm over a certain age. It really gives me the you know, whatever's. And Angela Watt, hi Angela, good to see you online. Please could Nancy elaborate on what were perceived as negative interactions with ethics committees?
I think I just gave an example.
Yeah, well, that's true. Okay. Also, in relation to people living with dementia being on an HREC, great idea. Also, perhaps family members, carers of people, etc., etc. So yeah, I think that you're right. I'm just trying to find. Can't scroll down on that question. I'd be interested in the panel's definition concept of consumer. I think we need to broaden our thoughts about this. Need to cast net wider beyond highly educated lay professionals. Thoughts on that, Nancy?
Look, I think that that's true. I think that you want to get a broad representation. So as people age, you know, they get more and more different from each other, right? Because they have all these lived experiences and stuff happens to you, right? And so I think trying to get across all of the questions that might come up, you know, so, right, if you only have a certain slice of the population, like older retired academics spring to mind, then you're going to get that slice, right? So I agree with that. And I think that, you know, we have younger people living with dementia, we have centenarians, we have people who, you know, might lose capacity or other functionality at a really early rate. We can have people who are 85 and bungee jumping. So, you know, I think that the definition of ageism is just on the chronological age. And if that's the question in the back of your mind, then what you need for consumers is that broad range, but also every aspect of the ethics needs to not be falling into that trap.
And you know, Nancy, like this concept of vulnerability is, you know, in large part offensive actually, because one is not vulnerable in and of itself. One is vulnerable because of, you know, certain things. Just because one is past a certain age, as you correctly point out, does not make one vulnerable per se. So
just because I have an illness doesn't mean I'm suffering. Just because I have, you know, I can be aging well. I really believe this. You can be aging well with a congenital illness, with whatever, right? You can be aging well. We can't, this is part of what is holding back this idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Nancy, I'm going to stop there because we have to whip through these, like a really great and relevant talk, and I think one which resonates with many of us because we understand the value of lived experience, and the question is sometimes how to access that in a meaningful way, because rather than a tokenistic way, just because sometimes it's difficult to do that. But really,
very happy for people to email me. So if you have questions.
And your email is, I'm guessing, n.pachana@uq.edu.au.
That is exactly right.
Yeah, well, there you go. And thank you for mentioning a wonderful UQ ethics committee, by the way. So very, very good. I'll pay you for that one later. It's probably not my one, by the way. Okay, Nancy, thank you very much. We will now move on to the